Hey everybody, Jacob's Painting here with part 3 on the Marneus Masterclass, and today we are going to be doing some glazing and some washing. I'm going to talk about both of those techniques and show you some of those on some parts of this model that we need to base some colors in. And to do that, we're going to start off with some of the white emblems for the ultramarine signals, and I'm using some dark pale blue, and this is just a simple base coat. I'm going to be basing in these areas, so I got one right here on this little hanging emblem on his shoulder pad and one on his power fist. And you don't have to use this specific color, I just like building up whites through different types of cool grays, so dark pale blue is kind of like the name suggests, a darker blue gray, and we're going to be building up off of this through some glazes, and I'll be talking about that technique when we get there. Alright, so our second step in building up these colors, I'm going to take a mid-tone gray, this is Celestra gray from Citadel, and I'm going to get most of that paint out of the brush before I actually touch it to the model, because we're going to be building this up through glazing. And glazing is a technique, it's not a product, so even though Citadel sells paint in pots that say glaze on them, those are just bottled techniques, and even then they're not all that great. I'm not a huge fan of the Citadel glazes. Glazing is just applying very thin paint in layers to apply a brighter filter to whatever you're painting on top of. So in this case we're using our Celestra gray, and I'm barely putting any paint on the model at all, and I'm going to be doing this in a number of layers, and it actually goes really quickly because you're applying the layers so thin. So get most of that moisture out of your brush before touching it to the model, and then go from there. And to finish that off, we're going to be glazing up some Ulthuan gray. It's a much brighter light gray, almost an off-white, and this is going to make these emblems look white, and that's why I like using it, because you don't ever really want to use pure white paint unless you're doing some little tiny detail highlights. So don't ever try to paint with pure white, it's not going to work out great for you. And again, I'm going to be glazing this Ulthuan gray, even more so than the Celestra gray, because this paint is kind of tricky to work with. It's really good for building up off-whites, but again, it's really tricky, so you want to get your glaze game down. Alright, now that we got those whites built up, I'm going to work on our purity seals and this little banner that's sculpted onto his leg. Got some heavy brown from Vallejo Game Ex-Opaque, and I'm going to be building that up on top of these browns that we based in earlier when we did our leather work. And the reason I did that is to make it easier to build up our off-whites for our parchment colors, because building these colors up off of a really dark color like black or blue is just a lot more work. So when I put on the leather colors, I went ahead and based these out just because it would save me some time down the road. Alright, for our second color, I've got some buff from Model Color. This is a really nice khaki color, kind of a bone color. I like using this for my purity seals and parchment. It gets that old paper color down really nicely. And I'm just going to be glazing this over our heavy browns. And again, buff is a great color, but it's a little tricky to work with, so that's why I like glazing with it. So I'm going to get most of the moisture out of my brush before I actually touch it to the model, and I'm going to be applying very thin coats of this. Just put down a couple of strokes where you want it and then let it sit. Don't try to sit there and move it around and get it to sit down, because you're just going to give yourself a headache. It's a tricky paint, it's not going to want to stick to the model that easily. So just get it into your head that when you're glazing, it's going to take 4 or 5 coats, but with the way glazing works, it's really quick. And after that, I'm going to take some ivory and mix it about 50-50 with the buff, just because I want this a little bit brighter before we do a wash. When we finish the wash cycle and we go back to start doing all of our detail highlights, I am going to highlight parts of these parchment with pure ivory to really pop them out. But buff by itself is a little too dark. I want these to be a little bit brighter and a little bit cleaner. So I have this 50-50 mix of buff and ivory to get us where I want to be. And I'm just, again, going to be glazing that over these to slightly build up that color in increments, and then go from there. Next, we're going to work on our wax part of the purity seals, and I've got some Black Red from Vallejo Model Color. This is a really deep maroon color, and I'm going to be basing that for all their wax parts. And again, that brown is still there from when we blocked in all the leathers previously, so putting this really dark maroon over that brown is really easy. Not really doing any glazing here. This is just a simple base coat to block in those wax seals on the purity seal, and so I'm just going to go around the model and block those in. Our next step for these purity seals is going to get some dark red from Model Color. This is a nice scarlet color, and I'm just going to be doing a simple highlight, nothing too special here. These are the kind of old style purity seals where it's just a ring around the center of the purity seal, so I'm just going to be highlighting that ring up to pop out that detail a little bit, and super easy peasy, just get that blocked in and then we'll go from there. Alright, now we're going to move into doing our wash step, but we need to do something first, and that's going to be to put a gloss varnish onto the model. And I'm using the Vallejo gloss varnish mixed with some flow improver. When it comes to using these varnishes from Vallejo, I like to mix the gloss varnish with flow improver and the matte varnish with paint thinner, because I just think they work that way. It's totally optional. You can do it however you want, but just my personal preference is to thin it with flow improver. And I've got our air turned down fairly soft. I don't want to blast through this entire pot of gloss varnish really quickly before I get a full coat on the model. So I like to turn the air down a little softer and just get all over the model. Make sure you're constantly moving the airbrush, constantly turn the model over until you get a nice thin coat all over. And it's going to take about an hour to dry at minimum. That's what I recommend. Alright, now that we've got our gloss varnish set up, I'm going to pull out the Army Painter wash system. I've got some dark tone and some Quickshade wash mixing medium. You can see I take like one little drop of the mixed medium and put in a bunch of dark tone and then mix it up. And you can see that even though the mixed medium is a transparent medium, it does brighten up that wash a little bit. So if you want a darker wash, then just add a little bit more dark tone until you're happy. It's not going to really change it. The mixed medium is still going to do its thing, even if it's not color tinting your wash. And then I'm going to lather the wash mix all over the model, get it totally coated, and then I'm going to take my time and wick away all the excess. And because we have the gloss varnish and we're using the mixed medium, the wash is going to flow really easy all over the model. And what that means is you're going to end up getting puddles everywhere that a puddle can gather. So that's why I like to take my time, go around the model, wick away all that excess, and just constantly keep checking it until all of that wash is going to sit where it's going to dry. Because as you do this, as you wick away the excess wash, more is going to flow down over time. It takes probably 3 to 5 minutes for it to totally get where it's going to be. So in that 3 to 5 minutes, you want to be constantly turning it around, looking where all those puddles are forming. If you need to get a little bit of water on your brush to help out that process, I recommend you do that. I do that all the time myself. Just, you might see like a little puddle start staining a place, and before that totally sets up, you want to get some water on your brush and kind of rub that off very gently to get that wash situated. Alright, so here he is. The wash is totally dried, but you can see he's still pretty shiny from the gloss. And before we do any more painting, we are going to matte coat him back, but there's one more step that I want to do. The metals aren't really situated where I want them to be, so I'm going to take some straight dark tone just by itself, and I'm going to gently brush and dab that over certain detail areas on our metallics so that the recessed details get super dark and very contrasted. And what that does is it really helps the details on our metallic section pop out. So I'm just going to take a moment to go in and find areas of detail where maybe that wash was a little too thin and wasn't concentrated enough, and get some of that pure dark tone down in there. You can see I'm focusing on the feathers of his little eagle shield and on the details of his right shoulder pad, just kind of getting some dark tone down into the deepest details just to increase that contrast a little bit and make those details pop. Alright, so here's him totally done with the wash, and now what we're going to do is give him a nice matte varnish, and this is going to do two things. It's it's going to add another layer of protection, and it's going to uniform the finish on everything. So right now we've got some gloss varnish showing through, we've got some parts that are matted down because that's where the wash dried, and it just looks awful. So this matte varnish is going to uniform all of those finishes for the entire model, and the bonus is that it's going to make it easier to paint on, because after you apply a gloss varnish, normal paint isn't really going to want to stick to that model in those areas because it's super shiny and glossy, and the paint does not like to stick to those surfaces because it's so slick. So this matte varnish is going to uniform everything and get us to a point where we can keep on painting. Here he is, got the matte varnish totally dry. The matte varnish takes almost no time at all to dry, just a handful of minutes, and you're ready to go. Again, I like using the paint thinner from Vallejo with the matte varnish. I just think it works a little bit better. And so we're totally done with this part of the painting process, and when we come back, we're going to start all of the detail work. So this is kind of the big in-between step that really turns the corner for this model, and after that, we're going to start doing all of our detail stuff and get him to a more finished place. So make sure to check us next time. I'd like to give a shout out to all of our new Patreon supporters real quick. Thank you so much. If you would like to get early access and exclusive content over on Patreon, make sure to check out the link below. Thank you.